Welcome to Miyconst Hardware. About half a year ago I have made a guide about X99 platform for AliExpress shoppers. There I have told which motherboard you shall buy and which one you shall avoid. First I thought that this video is kinda useless because all the information is already available in my videos where I do detailed testing about these motherboards. But it turns out that the video is one of the most popular on my channel, that's why I have decided to make the version 2 with all the updates with what has happened during the last half a year. During this time we have lost many X99 motherboards available previously and have got quite a few new ones. The biggest change is that the Chinese have started to use cheap B85 chipsets and other chipsets such as H81, Z87 and Q87 instead of the traditional X99 C612 chipsets. Anyway, this is gonna be the ultimate X99 guide for the AliExpress shoppers, but in this video I'm going to cover only X99. Yes, I know that there are multiple other different options to assemble budget and not very budget computer, but in this video I'm going to cover only X99 LGA 2011 version 3. Otherwise the video is going to be extremely long. Before I start the guide itself, I would like to mention a few important things. First of all, I always recommend you to buy what you need and not what is fancy. For example, if you need a budget gaming computer, buy a budget motherboard and a budget CPU. There is absolutely no need to buy flashy Huananzhi X99-TF motherboard and then install a Xeon E5 2620 V3. It's pointless. You don't have to be future-proof because the future-proof is actually not working, at least it's not working with X99 platform. X99 platform is already almost dead. It is good if you need to save money, but if you plan to invest more into the motherboard for the sake of future-proofness, do yourself a favor and buy AM4 or LGA 1200 motherboard. The best CPU you can get on LGA 2011 version 3 X99 will be a 22-core Xeon with about 3.5 GHz speed without turbo boost unlock. This CPU might be good if you're doing some kind of financial calculations or other sorts of mathematical calculations, but it will be horrible at gaming, and also by the time you will be able to afford this CPU there will be other options for 12 cores or maybe even 8 cores which will be better than this 22-core monster. Now let's start with some most common questions about X99 LGA 2011 version 3, which I am getting all over the place. Most of my viewers probably know answers for many of these questions, and if you're not interested, feel free to skip straight to the section that you find interesting. But let's start. All Xeon E5 2600 CPUs, doesn't matter is it X79 or X99, it doesn't matter if it's version 0, version 2, version 3 or version 4, all of the Xeon E5 2600 CPUs have locked multiplier. You cannot overclock them. If you want to overclock your CPU, do not buy Xeon E5 2600. Another misconception is that it is possible to do turbo boost unlock with the Xeon E5 V4 CPUs. Turbo boost unlock is a unique feature of Xeon E5 V3 CPUs, and it's only working with the CPUs which have locked multiplier. For example, if you have Intel Core i7, it is absolutely pointless to do turbo boost unlock because you can overclock this CPU using the CPU clock multiplier. Even more, if you try to use Core i7-5820K for example with a turbo boost unlocked BIOS, most likely your motherboard will not boot and your system will be bricked. You will have to either restart the BIOS or install Xeon E5 2600 CPU to be able to boot and restore to the original BIOS. And no, I'm not able to hack around and figure out how to implement turbo boost unlock with the Xeon E5 V4 CPUs. All Xeon E5 CPUs have power consumption limitations or so-called TDP rating. This TDP limitation is not possible to bypass, and with all locked CPUs, the TDP limit is also locked. Yes, I know, and yes, I have seen these videos where people use Huananzhi motherboard and overclock the CPU and unlock the TDP. This is only possible if you have a CPU with unlocked multiplier, for example Xeon E5 1650 V3 or Xeon E5 1660 V3. These settings are not working with the Xeon E5 2600 V3 V4 CPUs, so please stop giving me links to those videos and claiming that some done and I can't do it. I have also tested that hack which is disabling TDP readings over the CPU, but unfortunately it's not working the way we would want it to work. The CPU is still not clocking as high as we would want to, but it starts to suck a lot of power, overheats and overloads the VRM. That is why I strongly do not recommend to use these hacks which will disable TDP limitation in the CPU, because you're not getting higher clocks, but you're getting much higher CPU power consumption, and the system goes absolutely out of control when it comes to sucking power from the electricity socket. Another very common question is how to overclock RAM with your E5 2620 V3. The answer is it's not possible. All Xeon E5 V3 CPUs which have locked multiplier, they also have locked memory clock multiplier. If your CPU is designed by the specification to work with the DDR4 1866, there is no way you will be able to bypass it. It is only possible to overclock RAM with the CPUs which have unlocked multiplier, such as E5 1650, 1660 V3 and Core i7 CPUs. There are some very unique Asus and other motherboards which have external clockers for the memory, which are able to cheat on the CPU and force the memory to work faster than it was designed. But this requires an extra piece of hardware which will actually do the trick, and not many of the X99 motherboards have it. Not a single Chinese motherboard has this feature, and I really doubt the Chinese will ever implement it. So you can still use memory DDR4 3200, but if you install E5 2620 V3, maximum speed will be DDR4 1866. If you install E5 2678 V3, maximum speed will be DDR4 2133. Another myth about branded motherboards is that they are much better than the Chinese options because they support BCLK or base clock overclocking. Reality is that we do not have this feature with the Chinese X99 motherboards, but the value of BCLK overclocking is kinda zero. Because if you do BCLK overclocking to make your system stable, you most likely will have to raise the voltage, and if you raise the voltage, CPU will start to consume more power. And if CPU consumes more power, it reaches the TDP limit faster and then it starts to downclock itself. Which means if you apply Turbo Boost Unlock with the Xeon E5 V3 CPU and then try to increase BCLK, this will force the CPU to consume more power, thus it will reach the TDP limit faster and it will start to downclock itself faster, which means that BCLK overclocking is basically negating the Turbo Boost Unlock hack and you're getting worse performance than without BCLK overclocking. Many people also ask me about overclockable BIOS for the new Chinese X99 motherboards. Well, these motherboards, or at least most of them, use cheap desktop chipsets such as B85, Q87 and H81. These chipsets do not have overclocking capabilities, so the answer is BIOS with overclocking capabilities for these motherboards will never come. Z87 chipset in theory has overclocking possibilities, and sometimes, somewhere, someone could be able to make an overclockable BIOS for Z87 chipset, but so far we do not have such thing. Even motherboards which sometimes randomly use Z87 chipset still do not come with a BIOS which has overclocking capabilities. For example, JingSha X99-E8I motherboard may come with Q87 and Z87 chipset. Q87 does not have overclocking capabilities, Z87 in theory has overclocking capabilities, but the motherboard comes with a BIOS which does not have overclocking capabilities. LGA 2011 version 3 and DDR3 is also a very important topic. Quite often people are texting to me and asking why their system is not booting up, and it turns out that they are buying the cheapest DDR3 motherboard, buying the cheapest CPU, which is E5 2620 V3, plugging everything together, and it doesn't start. Well, the problem is that E5 2620 V4 and V3 do not work with the DDR3 memory. This is not because of the motherboard and it's not because of the memory, this is just the CPU. Reality is that there are only a few Xeon E5 V3 CPUs which can work with the DDR3 memory. It doesn't matter if you use DDR3 or DDR4 motherboard, your CPU is the limiting factor. List of the CPUs which are working with the DDR3 memory you will see on your screen, but it's important to mention that there is not a single V4 CPU which can work with the DDR3 memory. That's why if you're buying DDR3 motherboard, make sure that you have or will buy a CPU which also works with the DDR3 memory. DDR4 compatibility is also a painful subject. If you're buying cheap DDR4 memory modules from AliExpress, it is very likely that they will not work with the X99 platform. The problem is not with the memory and not with the motherboard and not with the CPU. The problem is the compatibility. Everything is working as it is designed, but the newer memories from China are simply not compatible with the old X99 motherboard. This all comes down to the bank's layout of a memory module. Here it is important to understand that memory bank is not equal to the memory capacity. You can have an 8GB memory module with 4 banks, 8 banks, and 16 banks. I'm not going to explain what is a memory bank. If you're interested to understand how that works and what technically it means, you can go online, search in Google, and you will find the answers. Here it is important to understand that if you're buying memory for an X99 motherboard from China or AliExpress, you shall always ask the seller to give you 16-bank memory module. It doesn't mean that the memory module has to be 16GB. It has to be 16 banks, and it might be 4GB or 8GB in size. From my personal testing, I can say that all memory modules which have only 4 banks did not work on the X99 platform. Memory modules which have 8 banks might be working, might not be working. I had a few of those, but it was a bit contradicting because some software were reporting that my modules had 8 banks and other software were reporting that it was 16 banks. That's why it is a bit confusing, but those modules were working for me. Nevertheless, I have seen some reports online that true 8 banks memory modules are actually not working on the X99 motherboards. Thus, if you want to be on the safe side, you need to buy 16 banks memory modules. Again, 16 banks does not mean 16GB, but most likely if you're getting 16GB memory module, it will be 16 banks. If you're getting 8GB memory module, it can be 4, 8 or 16 banks. If you're getting a 4GB memory module, it most likely will be 4 banks. That's why if you want to be on the safe side and you do not have any option to validate what is the memory configuration and memory layout of what you are buying, go ahead and buy 16GB memory module. I have also received multiple different reports from multiple different people that Chinese NVMe M.2 SSD drives are not working on the X99 motherboards. I'm not sure if that's true or not true because I did not have a chance to validate it myself. I didn't buy those Chinese M.2 SSD drives, but since I have got so many different reports about people not being able to make them work, I tend to believe that there is a compatibility issue. If you're buying an M.2 SSD drive from China for an X99 motherboard, then also ask the seller if it's compatible or not, and at least you can search online and see if someone else was able to make it work with an X99 motherboard. In many cases, when people were talking to me and asking how to solve the problem, it turned out that they were trying to install NVMe SSD into a SATA port or a SATA SSD into NVMe port, but still there were quite a few other reports where people actually used NVMe drive in an NVMe slot and it didn't work, so the compatibility issue is there. Nevertheless, you shall always validate your motherboard setup, and if you have SATA M.2 ports, you buy SATA SSD drive. If you have NVMe M.2 ports, you buy NVMe SSD drives. And the last thing I would like to mention before I go into the motherboards overview is Xeon E5 V4 ES and QS compatibility. Many people don't even know what ES and QS stand for, but they see on AliExpress that there is a Xeon E5 whatever with so many cores and with a so good price, and they just buy it. ES means engineering sample and QS means qualification sample. ES are engineering samples, which means they are pre-production samples. Most of these CPUs have different characteristics compared to the final retail samples of the CPUs, and many of them are not compatible with the Chinese X99 motherboards and even with the branded motherboards. Thus, I strongly recommend to avoid these CPUs, and if you buy it, well, it's on you and you have to make sure that it's working together with your motherboard and with your setup. Quite often I'm getting messages something like, I have done everything right, but my computer does not start. Well, when I'm getting such a message, the only thing I can say is, I feel sorry for you, too bad that it doesn't start. In order to be able to provide any sort of explanation of why your computer doesn't start, I need to know what is your motherboard, what is your CPU, what is your memory, what is your graphics card, what is on the postcodes on the motherboard if you have any, and what you have done to try to isolate the problem. Without this information, it's next to impossible for me to guess what's going on. In many such cases, it turned out that the person who was trying to contact me did everything right, connected everything right, set up everything right, but the CPU was an engineering sample Xeon E5 V4. Unfortunately, those engineering samples have very random compatibility with the X99 motherboards, especially from those from China. Thus, if you decide to buy the CPU against my recommendation, please talk to the AliExpress seller and figure out if your CPU is going to work with your motherboard. QS means qualification sample, and those are the samples which are made by Intel and AMD right before making the final CPU for sale in retail shops. In most cases, these QS samples have identical technical characteristics compared to the final retail chip, but sometimes they also may differ a little bit. In certain cases, they might be slightly better, but in most cases, they are slightly worse if they differ at all from the final retail chip. Those qualification sample CPUs in most cases can be bought, and in most cases they are compatible with the X99 from China and not from China. So here you have it, ES/QS explained, and I hope you will have less issues trying to combine your CPU and motherboard together. Now let's start to talk about the motherboards. For this video I have made a small table and filled up the motherboard names into the table cells. For this video I have made a small table where I have combined all Chinese X99 motherboard from AliExpress, so you can see straight away which motherboard is good, which motherboard is bad, which chipset is used, and what kind of memory configuration you have on the motherboard. Still, I'm going to talk about every motherboard in a separate slide or in separate chunk of the video, so if you have some certain motherboards you're interested to listen about, just follow the timestamps in the video description and you will get it. And this time I'm also planning to make text version of these slides, so for those who would want to read it in text, will be able to do that on my website. Let's start with the Huananzhi X99-TF, X99-T8 and X99-F8. This is still the best motherboard from China you can buy for the LGA 2011 version 3 platform. Unfortunately, the motherboard is slowly extincting from AliExpress and the prices are slowly going up, but the motherboard will still be available for some time, and so far it's the best available option from China on AliExpress. All three motherboards use the same BIOS and come in with the X99 or C612 chipset. These motherboards have old and new BIOS. The old BIOS has very long booting time, but it has runtime configuration and overclocking capabilities. The new BIOS boots much faster, but it does not have runtime configuration and does not have overclocking capabilities. Additionally, I can mention that there is a BIOS from iEngineer. It's available on GitHub. It's also available in Mi899. But some of these motherboards come with a defective or semi-defective BIOS chip, and if you try to use BIOS from iEngineer, the motherboard turns into a brick. For example, I have such a sample, and if I try to use BIOS from iEngineer, I have to use external CH341A to restore my motherboard back to normal life. Apart from the BIOS issues, the motherboard has very annoying VRM cooling fans. The two fans do not have speed adjustments, it's not possible to turn them on and off, they are just there, and very soon after you buy the motherboard, they start to have rattling or whistling or any other annoying sound, and you will have to do something about it. I have assembled multiple different workstations and gaming computers using these motherboards, and in all cases I was taking off the top lid, removing the annoying fans, throwing them out and mounting on top an M.2 heatsink and then putting back the lid. So I'm still using the original heatsink, but I am replacing the annoying fans with an M.2 heatsink mounted on a thermal pad. In this configuration, thermals of the VRM are increased, but only if you have good airflow in your chassis or in your case. Additionally, it's important to mention that even though the motherboard has two M.2 slots, only one of them is PCI Express X4 3.0. The other one is connected to the chipset and it is PCI Express 2.0 X4. M.2 slot for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth expansion cards has combined USB header with one of the USB 2.0 headers for the front panel. On the motherboard you will find two small jumpers to enable or disable USB connectivity for the M.2 slot. If you disable USB connectivity for the M.2 slot, the USB port will be available for the secondary USB header for the front panel. If you enable it, USB port will not be available in the front panel header, but will be available in the M.2 slot, and your Wi-Fi Bluetooth expansion card will work as Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. There is also a loudspeaker mounted on the motherboards. I think it is very annoying, but some people like it that the computer greets them with a beep signal when you click the power button. The next motherboard is Huananzhi X99-AD4 and AD3. These two motherboards are kinda cut-down version of X99-TF-F8 T8. We have only 4 memory slots compared to 8 memory slots, we do not have M.2 slot, and the motherboards do not work with the Huananzhi X99-TF BIOS. It is also not possible to read and write BIOS with FPT, you have to use AFU Win or AFU DOS. Personally, I have not tested these motherboards, but I have collected quite some information from my subscribers and from the internet, so overall the motherboards are quite decent, but the price difference between Huananzhi X99-AD4 and X99-F8 is so negligible that I don't see any reason to buy AD4 in favor of X99-F8. Still, if you happen to find the motherboard for a decent price, you're free to buy it. The motherboards still have the annoying VRM fans, and unlike Huananzhi X99-TF and T8, the AD3 motherboard cannot work with DDR3 1866. So far, only Huananzhi X99-TF and Huananzhi X99-T8 support DDR3 at speed of 2133. The other motherboards are limited to DDR3 1866. The good thing is that AD3 and AD4 still have the same VRM as X99-TF-F8, thus the recommended CPU from me would be something like E5 2678 V3 or E5 2697 V3. If you have a DDR4 version of the motherboard and you have flashed the BIOS with overclocking capabilities, then Xeon E5 1660 V3 with overclocking is also an option. Huananzhi X99-BD3 and Huananzhi X99-BD4. These are cheaper versions of AD3 and AD4. These two are using cheap B85 chipset, thus we have limited number of USB 3 ports and limited number of SATA 3 ports. Additionally to this, we are getting the cheap chipset problems such as invalid readings about temperature sensors and invalid readings about power consumption sensors. Still, the VRM is kinda decent and you can still install Xeon E5 2678, Xeon E5 2698 V3. The motherboards do not support any kind of overclocking due to the chipset, and you still get the annoying fans on the VRM. Huananzhi X99-8M and Huananzhi X99-8M-D3. These two were probably one of the best M80X X99 motherboards from China. The main limitation was the dual memory channel configuration and lack of memory timings in the original BIOS. The second problem was very easy to solve because the motherboard works perfectly fine with Huananzhi X99-TF BIOS. You can use FPT to flush the TF BIOS, and now you have overclocking capabilities and memory configuration with the timings and speed. Other than that, the motherboard did not have any major issues, sleep mode was working and M.2 slot works, but you're not getting M.2 slot for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth expansion cards. The motherboard also has speaker, and the motherboard also suffers from the long booting time if you're using the original X99-TF BIOS with overclocking and RAM timings configuration. CPU power delivery system was also slightly lowered compared to X99-TF, thus I would not install E5 2697 V3 on this motherboard. E5 2678 V3 would be fine though. Huananzhi X99-8M-F and Huananzhi X99-8M-T. These two are cheap versions of X99-8M and X99-8M-D3. Unfortunately, these motherboards are drastically different to the original expensive models, which are currently almost unavailable, and if they are available, then Chinese are asking too much for them. The cheap versions 8M-F and 8M-T are using B85 chipset and very much degraded VRM system or power delivery system. With the B85 chipset, the motherboard has got problems with the power consumption sensors, reduced number of USB 3 ports, and with the reduced VRM capacity, I will not recommend this motherboard for anything higher than E5 2620, E5 2640 V3. For the DDR3 version, I would recommend E5 2649 V3 if you can find that one for a reasonable price. Due to the dual-channel memory configuration, I can't recommend these motherboards because there are better alternatives with quad-channel memory configuration for about the same money. Additionally, I can say that I have seen multiple different reports from people complaining that the audio chip on the motherboard just died or didn't work out of the box. It did not happen with my motherboard, and it didn't happen with my friends' motherboards, and did not happen with the people that I know that bought this motherboard, but I have got some random messages from people texting me on Instagram or YouTube and saying that their audio chip on X99-8M-F just died out. In that case, people were forced to buy an external audio card and install it into the PCI Express X1 or PCI Express X4 slot to get audio output. Huananzhi X99-ZD4. This is like an enhanced version of X99-8M-F. The motherboard has 4 memory slots and quad-channel memory configuration. It has got 2 M.2 slots for NVMe and SATA, but still does not have M.2 for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. The motherboard also has got enhanced cooling for the VRM system. Thus, the VRM system is cooled better, and it would be okay to install something like E5 2678 V3 in Huananzhi X99-ZD4. The motherboard also has a better audio chip, and overall the quality is a bit better. Unfortunately, the asking price for the motherboard is absolutely unreasonable, that's why I don't see any use for the motherboard. JingSha X99-D8 and the JingSha X99-AD4. These two are the same, one for DDR4, another one for DDR3. Both of the motherboards are compatible with Huananzhi X99-TF BIOS, and overall the motherboard layout is very similar. In comparison to Huananzhi alternative, these two motherboards do not have VRM fans on the heatsink, but the VRM itself is slightly worse. I have tested multiple of these motherboards as well as multiple Huananzhi options, and I can say that in every case the JingSha motherboard had worse VRM. Efficiency of the VRM on the JingSha motherboards is degrading very fast when the VRM heats up, the motherboard is not able to achieve the same level of overclocking, and overall power consumption is slightly higher with the JingSha motherboard compared to Huananzhi motherboard. JingSha X99-D8 also does not have the secondary USB header for the front panel, that's why the M.2 slot for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth expansion cards is always functioning as Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, you don't have to switch anything on and off. In my personal computer I have JingSha X99-D8 paired with the Xeon E5 2690 V3 and Turbo Boost Unlock. This configuration successfully works for me for the last almost year, and now I plan to upgrade my CPU to E5 2697 V3. Unfortunately though, we still have the problem with very long booting time regardless of used BIOS, and the motherboard does not support DDR3 2133 if you would be using the DDR3 version. Even if you flash Huananzhi BIOS, the motherboard is still limited to DDR3 1866. This seems to be a hardware limitation and not a software limitation. Worst of all is that the motherboard is almost not available on AliExpress anymore, and the available options are ridiculously overpriced. It is also important to mention that lately I have got multiple reports from the people who bought the latest X99-D8 that these motherboards have quality issues. It seems like JingSha decided to cheap out and degraded the quality of these motherboards and decided to sell as many of them as possible while trying to cheap out as possible. This is very sad, and that's why I cannot recommend this motherboard to be purchased. JingSha X99-E8I is another alternative from JingSha to Huananzhi X99-TF, or at least they tried to position this motherboard this way because it looks almost the same as Huananzhi X99-TF. The motherboard even got the unknown VRM fans for no good reason. Unfortunately, this one is using cheap B85 chipset, and it is nowhere near Huananzhi X99-TF. The motherboard does not have any overclocking capabilities due to the B85, Q87 or Z87 chipset, number of USB ports and SATA 3 ports are limited, and you have malfunctioning temperature and power consumption sensors. Additionally to this, you have non-working sleep mode, and you're getting naked power rails for the 24-pin power connector on the motherboard. This is absolutely stupid to do, and I have no idea why Chinese decided to do that. If for some reason you have some small screw flying around and landing on those naked power rails on the motherboard, you will get your own local disaster in form of a burned out motherboard and small local kaboom. JingSha and Kllisre X99-D4. These two motherboards were competing with the Huananzhi X99-8M. They were using C612 or X99 chipset, worked with Huananzhi X99-TF BIOS, supported CPU overclocking and memory overclocking and RAM timings adjustments. Of course, you can overclock memory only if you have unlocked CPU. These days, the motherboards are almost not available on AliExpress, and if you can find them, the prices are super bad. I have also got multiple different reports stating that the quality of the latest X99-D4 is significantly worse than what it used to be at the beginning of the motherboard life cycle. Due to the quality issues, I do not recommend you to buy this motherboard, even if you find it for a reasonable price. Still, it's important to mention that on the green motherboard you have 4 SATA ports, but 2 of them will be blocked if you are going to use any kind of a semi-decent dual-slot graphics cards. This is very stupid, but Chinese did it, and the 2 SATA ports are basically unusable if you are using a dual-slot graphics card. JingSha or SZMZ X99-GT. This won one of the first motherboards with B85 chipset. The quality was kinda poor and the motherboard is kinda garbage. With B85H81 chipset we have only 2 SATA 3 ports and we have external via USB 3.0 controller, sleep mode doesn't work, temperature and power consumption sensors do not work, so I have no idea why you would buy the motherboard. VRM and VRM cooler is also pathetic, so if you see the motherboard for about 40 euros, maybe you can buy it, otherwise I would strongly recommend to avoid it. JingSha or SZMZ X99M-H. This is a kinda enhanced version of X99-GT. Even though the motherboard has 4 memory slots, it still has only 2 memory channels, and with B85H81 chipset we are still getting VIA controller for USB 3.0 ports and only 2 SATA 3.0 ports. The biggest limitation, of course, is the dual-channel memory configuration. The motherboard also comes with a non-working sleep mode, non-working temperature and power consumption sensors. Basically the same as X99-GD, I do not recommend this motherboard. There are better options with quad memory channel configuration for about the same money. Another option of the same motherboard is JingSha X99-MH2 or SZMZ X99-G2. Even though the motherboard has 4 memory slots, it's still only 2 memory channels, the same as the previous motherboard, but this time the motherboard has got 2 PCI Express X16 slots. Unfortunately, it is still X16 and X4. It is only the physical size of the second PCI Express slot, which is PCI Express X16. The connectivity is only PCI Express X4. The only use for this motherboard I can see is if you have an M80X chassis and for some reason you need 2 PCI Express X16 slots and you don't bother that the second one is just X4. It is also important to say that all of these motherboards do not work properly with Intel i7 CPUs, which have only 28 PCI Express lanes. If you install such CPU, for example i7-5820K, your first PCI Express X16 slot will be working as PCI Express X8, and the second PCI Express X16 or X4 slot will not be working at all. Machinist X99Z. This is the legendary M80X X99 motherboard from China. The motherboard has its issues, it's not perfect, but it's the best M80X motherboard from China you can get for LGA 2011 version 3 socket. Unfortunately, the motherboard is no longer available on AliExpress. Still, I will tell a little bit about the motherboard. The motherboard was available in 2 options, with a small radiator and with a big radiator. Other than that, they were absolutely identical. The big radiator was cooling VRM slightly better, but the small one was not blocking the 8-pin power connector for the CPU. For some reason, Chinese decided to mount the big radiator and did not see that if you install the big radiator, it is not really possible to plug in and plug out the 8-pin CPU power connector from the power supply. With some power supplies it is possible to do, which have small clip, and with the other power supplies it is possible to plug in, but it's not possible to plug it out because it's blocked by the radiator. The biggest problem of this motherboard was the non-working clear CMOS function. If you happen to apply BIOS settings which are not compatible with your hardware, the motherboard turns into a brick and you need to use an external CH341A or another USB flash programmer. Using USB flash programmer was not easy as well. In my cases, I had to plug in 24-pin power connector to the motherboard and use USB port which supports fast charging in order to be able to read and write the BIOS on the motherboard. There are multiple different BIOS options on the internet. Some of them claim that they have solved the clear CMOS function, but I have tested and retested that BIOS with many different X99Z version 102 motherboard. For some of the motherboard it works, on other motherboards clear CMOS still didn't work. What I can say for sure that the BIOS from iEngineer works the best. I have tested it and installed it on every X99Z motherboard which I have got after the BIOS release. This is the best BIOS you can get for Machinist X99Z version 102. You will get overclocking, runtime misconfiguration and clear CMOS works. Using Machinist X99Z version 102, I have assembled multiple different gaming and non-very gaming configurations and did not have a single complaint from my customers. If the motherboard had any sort of problem, I was able to identify it straight away. But all the time it was related to the original BIOS, which is absolutely disgusting. After flushing BIOS from iEngineer, I didn't have any issues. Machinist X99Z version 102A and Machinist X99Z version 104. This is supposed to be an updated or enhanced version of X99Z version 102. Unfortunately, it's not the case. Even though the motherboard looks identical, Chinese managed to screw up things. The biggest disappointment is that smartphone function is no longer working properly and USB 3.0 ports are having issues. It doesn't matter which BIOS I am using, even if I try to use BIOS from iEngineer, smartphone still doesn't work and USB 3.0 still have issues. I have talked to the Machinist seller and he has confirmed that these are defects which are coming from the factory and they can't do anything about it. Thus, the motherboard is still okay and you can still use it with something like E5 2620-2640 V3, but it's no longer the best motherboard which you can buy due to these problems. And if you keep in mind that the motherboard is being sold for much higher than it used to be, you would probably think twice or even thrice before you buy it. Machinist X99-K9 is another reincarnation of X99Z version 102. This time it is white, shiny and looking really good. Unfortunately, the motherboard has the same issues as X99Z version 102A. Means we do not have working smartphone and USB 3.0 have issues. Still, we have got something extra. This time it is M.2 slot for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth cards. I have tested the port, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth are working perfectly fine on the motherboard. If you can find the motherboard for a decent price and you don't bother that smartphone doesn't work, you can still buy it, but it is really sad to see that the Chinese decided to screw us up with a non-working smartphone and defective USB 3.0 ports, otherwise it would be one of the best motherboards. Alzenit X99-PE7 or Ronin X99. This was an ATX version of X99Z from Machinist. The motherboard is compatible with the same BIOS from iEngineer and the BIOS from Ronin X99 is compatible with Machinist X99Z. The first revision of the motherboard was not flawless. The motherboard had USB 3.0 issues and the M.2 SSD mounting was broken. I was in touch with the distributor who was responsible to sell these motherboards, and he confirmed to me that they know about these problems, but they still need to sell the batch of the motherboards they have made. Once the batch was sold, the motherboard was revised and released as Alzenit X99-PE7. That motherboard didn't have USB issues and did not have the broken M.2 mounting. All in all, you can buy this motherboard if you can find it on AliExpress. Every now and then they show up. It seems like some AliExpress stores have some extra stock that they suddenly find and decide to sell, so if you find such on sale for a reasonable price, feel free to buy it. When using BIOS from iEngineer, you're getting functioning overclocking, functioning memory configuration, sleep mode also works, and you're getting lots of connectivity as well as real X99 or C612 chipset. Veineda X99 is not a very popular motherboard and it was not many of them available on AliExpress. Overall, the motherboard is not that bad. We have quad-channel memory configuration, 2 PCI Express X16 slots. What's weird about the motherboard is that it has slightly bigger size than M80X but smaller than 80X. So if you have M80X chassis, the motherboard does not fit. If you have 80X chassis, then the motherboard does not fill up entire chassis. From the cons, I can also mention that the motherboard has only 2 fan headers. One is 4-pin, another one is 3-pin. And sleep mode is kinda weird. It doesn't work if I install Windows in Legacy mode or CSM, but it works if Windows is installed in UEFI mode. The sleep mode also doesn't work with Linux. The biggest issue about the motherboard is pathetic VRM and pathetic radiator. Even though BIOS comes with all the needed features such as runtime configuration and overclocking capabilities, and the motherboard uses X99 or C612 chipset, the VRM is limiting the CPU you can install onto the motherboard. Overall, the motherboard is not that bad, and if you can find it on AliExpress for a decent price, feel free to buy it, but as I said, they are kinda vanishing from AliExpress. Machinist or Alzenit X99-ICE5. I have been asked about this motherboard if and when I am gonna test it. Many people believe that the motherboard has mini ITX form factor and that's why they are tempting to buy it. In the reality, the motherboard is not mini IDX, it is mini DTX, which means that most of the mini ITX chassis will not be big enough to host the motherboard. And even if you are able to find a small mini DTX chassis or a big enough mini IDX chassis, which is able to host the motherboard, you will find it problematic to install 2-slot graphics card because the PCI Express slot location is too low, so you can only install 1-slot graphics card, and this means you probably can't make a gaming computer with this motherboard. Additionally to this, I can mention that the motherboard has absolutely pathetic VRM and tiniest radiator ever. The maximum CPU I would ever install on this motherboard is E5 2630L V3. If you happen to have this motherboard, then you should probably know that it is working with the BIOS from Machinist X99Z, and that BIOS is probably the best option for this motherboard because you're getting all the needed features. This Chinese miracle I have tested with the name Trash X99, but people are still buying the motherboard even though I have made the video. Sometimes there are some AliExpress sales and the motherboard is going for really cheap. And then people are obviously texting me and asking me how to solve the issues with the motherboard. Even though the motherboard looks very similar to Huananzhi X99-8M-T or Huananzhi X99-8M-D3, it's a completely different thing. The motherboard has 2 memory slots but only 1 memory channel. Yes, this is just one or single memory channel motherboard. Additionally to this, you get all heap of problems. Not working USB 3.0 ports, not working sensors for temperatures and power consumption, not working CPU turbo boost. And here I'm talking about CPU turbo boost, not about CPU turbo boost unlock. If you do not unlock your turbo boost with your CPU, then it does not turbo boost up to the maximum allowed frequency by the Intel specification. Still, you're able to implement turbo boost unlock if you would want so. All in all, as you could probably guess, I strongly do not recommend this motherboard in any circumstances. Another motherboard that I'm constantly asked about is ZX99-EV3. This motherboard can be found on AliExpress using all sorts of names. It can be PlexHD, it can be X99T, it can be X99 Turbo, it can be called Kllisre X99-D4, it can be called Atermiter or Atermiter, or Qiyida or something else. The motherboard can be green or orange. The motherboard can be with DDR3 or DDR4 memory slots. Still, it's all the same motherboard and it is known for its bad quality. I have personally tested a few of these boards and all of them had some sorts of issues. I have also received lots of different reports from my subscribers which have got this motherboard. For some USB ports don't work, for others PCI Express ports do not work, some have issues with the memory slots, others have issues with the CPU compatibility, and for someone the motherboard just dies someday and doesn't work anymore. I was also in touch with a representative from the factory which is making these motherboards, and they didn't even want to bother about my feedback. They went just straight away and made me understand that they don't give a shit about the quality of their product. They said it to me straight away. We do the product we do, and yes, it is not a decent quality for European market, but we have our customer base and we are earning money. If you like our product, you buy it. If you don't like it, you don't buy it, but stop telling us about the quality. So this is gonna be my advice. Stop buying the product which does not have a decent quality. Don't bother how much it costs and don't bother how many features it has. If it doesn't work, it is not worth anything. Please stop buying these motherboards and please stop asking me to make review of them. Machinist X99-RS9 is a cheap version of Machinist X99Z. This motherboard uses chip B85 chipset. With this chipset we have the standard problems of non-functioning temperature and power consumption sensors, as well as non-functioning sleep mode. Compared to Huananzhi X99-8M-F, we are getting quad memory channel configuration, but we do not have the sleep mode. The motherboard comes with a very bad BIOS, and with that BIOS you also get USB 3.0 issues. Luckily, you can use Huananzhi X99-8M-F BIOS on Machinist X99-RS9. With that BIOS, the motherboard is functioning pretty okay, but the sleep mode still doesn't work. This motherboard can be used for E5 2620, 2630 and 2640 V3. Unfortunately, the VRM or power delivery system is not the best. Jginyue X99M-Plus D4. This is another version of Machinist X99-RS9. We have exactly the same issues and exactly the same solution for the problems. We just have to use Huananzhi X99-8M-F BIOS, and the problems with USB 3.0 ports will be fixed, and you are also getting runtime configuration. Other than that, these are basically identical motherboards. Compared to Machinist X99-RS9, Jginyue X99M-Plus D4 and D3 have slightly worse VRM heatsink or radiator. As I said, D4, D3, this means DDR4 and DDR3 version. Since the motherboard is available in two variants, there will be people who will be tempted to install E5 2678 V3 on the DDR3 version. I would not recommend to do that because the motherboard is not capable to handle 120 watt load on the VRM. Still, if you decide to do that, or maybe you will install a slightly easier CPU such as E5 2673 V3, then please make sure that your VRM is not overheating, and most likely the motherboard will be just fine. Qiyida X99-H9, one more version of Machinist X99-RS9, but this time the motherboard is not only looking pretty bad with all those disgusting green colors, we are also getting a pathetic VRM radiator. If Machinist X99-RS9 and Jginyue X99M Plus uses screws to mount the radiator on top of the VRM, Qiyida X99-H9 is using plastic clips. These clips do not provide enough pressure to keep the radiator mounted close enough or tight enough to the MOSFETs or the VRM components, thus the VRM is overheating even more compared to Machinist X99-RS9. You can still buy Qiyida X99-H9 if you use CPUs like E5 2620, 2630 LV3. Kllisre X99 version 201. This is the worst version of Machinist X99-RS9. The motherboard is not only having the same pathetic VRM radiator as Qiyida X99-H9, it also uses the worst chipset. This time it's H81. With such chipset we are having only two SATA 3 ports and the other ones are SATA 2. We are also losing the M.2 slot for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth expansion cards. So you can still buy the motherboard and it still works. You can use it with E5 2620, 2630 LV3, but if for the same money you can get more, why should you buy X99 version 201? I don't know. I would not do that. A few days ago I have spotted and ordered a new motherboard from AliExpress, which is looking very much like Huananzhi X99-TF. The motherboard can be found under name of Kllisre and Qiyida. The major difference between these and Huananzhi X99-TF is that the VRM radiator does not have the disgusting fans from Huananzhi. So far I have not yet tested the motherboard, thus I can't tell really much about it, but from the motherboard looks I can say that it seems like the motherboard is using X99 or C612 chipset. Because without this chipset, Chinese would have to add some kind of external USB and SATA controllers to achieve the number of SATA and USB ports on the motherboard. Once I receive the motherboard and make a detailed review, I will try to add a link to this video and the link should pop up either there or there. But before that, I can only guess what we will get with this motherboard. On AliExpress you can also find this something. I don't even know what it is called and who made it and why people are selling it, and even more I don't understand why people are buying it. Still, I have got a couple of questions, people asking me how to overclock CPU using this motherboard. So the answer is you simply don't. The motherboard is using a H81 chipset which doesn't support any overclocking. Moreover, the motherboard has very bad quality and I strongly do not recommend you to buy it. If you happen to have the motherboard, make sure to validate every possible feature, and if the motherboard doesn't work as it is supposed to do, just send it back to China and don't bother. And to finish the motherboard comparison, let's talk a little bit about the branded options. Right now on AliExpress you can find MSI motherboards from 140 to 180 euros. These are quite decent options and I have personally tested a few of them. All of them are working very well and all of them have much better quality than anything from China, including Huananzhi X99-F. All of the motherboards are able to implement Turbo Boost unlock and it's not that hard, but you might have problems writing the modified BIOS. Some of the motherboards are also coming with pre-production BIOS, which means that the motherboard has the BIOS which you can't even download from the MSI website. This option might be not working properly and you would have to flash the latest BIOS from the MSI website, but for that you might need to have an external USB flash programmer because the original BIOS might refuse to write the BIOS from the MSI website as it will not pass the security checks. It is also worth to mention that not all of these motherboards will work with the registered ECC memory. Some of them do, others don't do. Thus, if you plan to use registered ECC memory, please make sure that you are buying the motherboard which fits you. Who should buy these boards? Well, it's really hard to justify the asking price, but if you really want to overclock a Xeon E5 1660 V3 or you have an i7 for X99 platform, then this might be a good option for you. Another alternative would be if you already have a computer which is LGA 2011 version 3 and then your motherboard has died and you just need a motherboard. In that case, it will be cheaper for you to get a new board rather than entire motherboard, CPU and possibly memory. Other than that, I really do not advise you to spend that much more money to buy an outdated and old X99 motherboard, while you can basically get i3-10100F plus B460 motherboard for the same money. The motherboards are over, but what about the CPUs? By the end of March 2021, we still have Xeon E5 2620 V3 as the best value for your money Xeon E5 CPU. It is really hard to beat this CPU at 20 euros with the 6 cores 12 threads at 3.2 GHz. Xeon E5 2630L-V3 is another alternative. It has 8 cores, 16 threads, but the frequency is only up to 2.9 GHz. You probably will not be too bad with either of them, but I prefer E5 2620 just because it has slightly higher frequency and it will do slightly better in certain games which rely on the CPU clock frequency. But if you have a motherboard with very limited VRM capacity, in that case you might need to opt out for a Xeon E5 2630L-V3 instead of E5 2620 V3. My overall favorite CPU is a Xeon E5 2640 V3. Right now it costs only 40 euros, and for this money you're getting 8 cores, 16 threads at 3.4 GHz. This is really good and the CPU performs pretty good in games and productivity tasks. Yes, if the price will go up to 50 euros, it's no longer that good of an option, but if the price will drop to something like 30-35 euros, this will be like a golden CPU. And for those who are seeking for the best value for your money with the DDR3 memory, you shall look at Xeon E5 2673 V3. This CPU, the same as the big brother E5 2678 V3, has 12 cores, 24 threads, but the frequency is slightly reduced to 3.1 GHz. The good thing is that it costs just 65 euros. When combined with the DDR3 compatible motherboard and DDR3 memory, you're getting very good value for your money. Yes, it's not as good as E5 2678 V3, which is slightly more expensive, but you are getting very decent system for very little money. Xeon E5 2678 V3 is still the go-to CPU for LGA 2011 version 3 platform. 12 cores, 24 threads, 3.3 GHz turbo frequency, and with Turbo Boost unlock you will get all cores running at this speed. For the price of 80 euros, it's really hard to beat the value of this CPU, especially if you mount it on a motherboard with the DDR3 support and use the cheap DDR3 memory. It is important to mention that DDR4 prices are going slightly down and DDR3 prices are going slightly up, so the difference between DDR3 and DDR4 is not that big anymore, but still, you're saving a few pennies here and there, and then you get extra money to buy some extra components for your computer. If you're looking to get a bit more performance and are willing to spend a bit more money, then take a look at the Xeon E5 2697 V3. In my opinion, it's the most balanced CPU from the Xeon E5 V3 series. It has 140 watt TDP limitation, which is very good. Having 14 cores and a turbo boost frequency up to 3.6 GHz, this 145 watt TDP limitation will be very important to upkeep or maintain the higher CPU clock frequency compared to E5 2698 V3, which I have tested not long ago. And if you want to go completely bananas and want to spend even more money, well, then you can take a look at the Xeon E5 2699 V3. This CPU can be found on AliExpress for something like 260 euros, and you're getting 18 cores, 36 threads, with the turbo frequency up to 3.6 GHz. Of course, the CPU is not going to maintain this frequency on all CPU cores, but if you're doing some heavy mathematical or financial calculations, this might be a good option for you. For everyone else, I would not recommend to buy this CPU. Of course, there will be someone asking me why I didn't say anything about Xeon E5 V4 CPUs, because the prices are going down and now these CPUs are better than V3. Well, no, they are not. Let's take a look at the V4 series. What are we getting here? E5 2680 V4, 14 cores, 28 threads, 3.3 GHz turbo frequency, but we do not have turbo boost unlock. So what are we getting? Productivity performance is the same as E5 2678 V3, gaming performance is worse than E5 2678 V3. Why would you want to pay 120 euros compared to 80 euros of E5 2678 V3? I don't understand. It could be a good CPU for those who are sitting and looking at the watt meter and being happy that their system is not consuming as much electricity as it could be consuming, but if you keep in mind that the most electricity will be consumed by your graphics card during gaming, then I don't think those 15% of electricity savings are worth paying 40 years extra to get E5 2680 V4 in comparison to E5 2678 V3. Another pointless CPU is E5 2683 V4. Here we are getting 16 cores, but the turbo frequency is further reduced to just 3 GHz. Same picture, we are getting more cores but lower frequency and no turbo boost unlock, so we are getting about the same performance as E5 2678 V3 in productivity tasks and significantly or slightly lower performance in games. Does it make sense to pay more to get the same or worse performance to save a few watts of electricity? No, I don't think so. But if you really badly want to have those extra watts of electricity saved on your bill, well, fine, you are free to buy the CPU, it still works and it still serves the purpose. If you're one of those who are just buying interesting Xeon CPU toys and don't really bother about the economical reasonability, then you can get a Xeon E5 2697A V4. This CPU has the same 16 cores, but the turbo frequency goes up to 3.6 GHz and TDP is 145 Watt. This will be of course a much better option than E5 2683 V3, but it also costs more than twice as much. So it doesn't make any economical sense to buy this CPU, but if you just find it enjoyable to play around with these Xeon CPUs, well, go ahead and get one and take a look and figure out what the CPU is capable of. If you want to get the best of the best and don't really bother about how much it costs, then you can get E5 2699 V4. 22 cores up to 3.6 GHz will be a good calculating machine if you're really doing some kind of a heavy calculation duties. Otherwise, the CPU is totally pointless. In a few years, or maybe even now, you can buy an 8-core or 16-core CPU which will beat this Xeon in almost everything. That was a really long and exhausting video. I hope you have enjoyed it, I hope you are going to find it interesting, and I hope you're gonna collect some useful information to help you decide what kind of X99 system you would want to build, or if you want to build an X99 system at all. For now though, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, bye bye.